Hey, what you reading for?
Was the 80s a good decade for horror? Some people look back fondly on the 1980s. I have successfully repressed all my childhood memories, so I honestly do not remember if the 80s was a good decade for horror or not, but I am willing to get my hands dirty to reach back into that 80s hairspray hardened mire and find out. So in this 10-part video series, I'm going to go through the decade year by year, looking at all the horror that was released. I'll pick 3 titles that I think were impactful or simply look cool to me. I'll read them with fresh eyes, then report back to you and share my thoughts. A few parameters. I understand that the 80s were dominated largely by Stephen King and V.C. Andrews. I will not be reading any books from either of those authors, simply because there are already hundreds and hundreds of booktubers talking about Stephen King. I don't need to throw my hat into that crowded ring. And V.C. Andrews, I'm not sure if I would qualify her work as horror. I don't know. But in any event, she wrote for younger readers, and I am going to try to pick books that were targeted for older readers like me. I do have some preconceived ideas about horror from the 1980s, that it's heavy on schlock and shock and not so heavy on quality. I don't know if that's true, but I am going to find out. And in the process, I expect I'll find a few gems and a few not so gems. Regardless, I will give you my honest and hopefully insightful opinions. If you're new to this channel, consider subscribing. It keeps the channel growing and keeps me motivated to keep putting out videos, and I do appreciate the support. We'll begin with a short montage featuring the music of Alfred Schnittke and some cover art from horror books that were released in 1980. See if you can guess which 3 I picked to read for this experiment. And I'll see you on the other side to talk books. 1980, a brand new year to a brand new decade. A year that would be a harbinger of things to come. In 1980, Pink Floyd gave us The Wall, whereas at the end of the decade, The Wall, the infamous one in Berlin, would be taken down. At the latter half of the decade, Clive Barker would give us the Lament configuration. In 1980, the Hungarians gave us a slightly less horrific puzzle cube with, if you're using it right, with less bloody results. In the 21st century, Takashi Shimizu would have a huge hit with vengeful ghosts that haunt a house in Tokyo. In 1980, the Japanese would give us more playful ghosts that float around a maze and chase a giant yellow mouth. 1980 was also a year of returns. In cinemas, the Empire was striking back. And in the rock charts, AC/DC was back, and this time in black. But what did 1980 give us in horror books? Well, since it's a new year to a new decade and a new video series for me, I decided for the first installment to focus on debuts. And it so happens that 1980 gave us 3 debuts from 3 authors that would go on to have quite an impact on the world of horror. I read these 3 debuts and I have opinions. Published in January of 1980, The Cellar, the debut novel from Richard Laymon. Richard Laymon would go on to have huge success. He would be nominated for the Bram Stoker Award twice. for Flesh in 1988, and again for Funland in 1990. He would win the Bram Stoker Award for Best Horror Novel of the Year posthumously in 2001 for The Traveling Vampire Show. And he would be the president of the Horror Writers Association during the last year of his life. He died on Valentine's Day in 2001. Prior to researching books for this video series, I had never read Richard Laymon. I chose The Cellar not only because it's a debut, but also because The Traveling Vampire Show had been on my TBR for ages. So I figured this was a good occasion to check out Richard Laymon. I didn't have any expectations for this read, other than I expected it to be good, which it was not. Now, please believe me that I want to be positive on this channel. I want to tell you about books that I love. But the parameters I created for this experiment were such that, I pick 3 books, I read them, and I tell you about them. So it is what it is. And it is not a promising start to this experiment. But trust me, I've read on and it does get better. I want to be positive, but it would be impossible for me to say anything positive about this book. About 30 or 40 pages in, after some exposition and some hyper-violence, okay, a child, a young girl, is raped. And it's done flippantly, in passing, like with a smirk and a shrug. I should have DNF'd the book right then, but it's a short book, it's a quick read, and I figured maybe the author is just trying to overdo it so that the reader hates the villain, and maybe it's just a gross detour from the plot. But no, it turns out that flippantly, I'd say gleefully, raping children is not a detour or a tangent in this book, but it is a recurring feature. Amid all the brutal murders and the child rape, the book tries to cram in a romance. The whole thing is just gross. It treats women badly, obviously. It treats the reader badly. The writing is sloppy. It has disinterest for the story it's trying to tell. This is the unqualified worst horror book, worst book period I have ever read. I am baffled that it was published. I was very surprised by this offering because Richard Laymon would go on to have quite a lot of commercial mainstream success. I don't know if his writing style changed or evolved as his career went on. But I am not going to read another book from him to find out. The Traveling Vampire Show is off my TBR. Richard Laymon is decidedly not for me. I'd tell you what the story is about, but the author didn't seem to care much about that, so why should I? Why should you? Not a good start to my 1980s retrospective, I know, but believe me, it does get better. Hang in there. It couldn't possibly get any worse than The Cellar, honestly. Also in January of 1980, we got another important debut, Off Season by Jack Ketchum. Jack Ketchum would go on to be a very successful horror writer with several of his books turned into successful movies such as Red and The Girl Next Door and The Woman. Jack Ketchum would go on to write a follow-up to this book called Offspring in 1991. I actually read this book several years ago. I did not read it for this video series, truth be told. And I talk about Off-Season in 2 of my videos, Scariest Books Ever and The Most Disturbing Books I've Ever Read. If you've seen either of those videos, you'll know that I didn't actually like this book Quite simply, it was too much for me. It's savage, it's graphic. It centers around a group of friends who stay in a cabin in a small beachside New England town during the off-season when a clan of inbred cannibals attacks. And these cannibals, this clan, they are technically human, but they're something less than human. They are savage humanoid animals. Now, the reason why I didn't like it is because it's savage and graphic, and while I don't mind violence and gore, and it's just that without any supernatural element to distance me from the story, it was just, or distance me from the action, it was just too graphic and too real. Plus, there's a home invasion aspect to it that really disturbed me. And it was just, frankly, too much. Not at all comparable to The Cellar, which is tasteless and inane. Off-season is well-written and purposeful. And it could be a great read for the right reader. That reader just is not me. I would like to share with you a review from one of my favorite booktubers, Cliff's Dark Gems. He really liked this book, and I think he puts it best. I read this book in one sitting, and the violence, sheer brutality, and depravity blew me away. It did take a while to get going, but Ketchum writes so incredibly well that I had no choice but to keep turning the pages. Be warned that this book is dark, intense, and extremely graphic, and most definitely not for the squeamish or faint of heart. I would not consider myself squeamish, but the realism and the home invasion aspect of it, too much for me. I will not be reading another Jack Ketchum book. He's not the right author for me. But again, if you are into savage, realistic horror and you are not squeamish or faint of heart, I think Off-Season could be a good read for you. In March of 1980, we got another debut, Slither by John Halkin. Look at that beautiful cover. Slither, a book about bloodthirsty worms, would enjoy a fair amount of success. Enough so that John Halkin would reuse that formula with jellyfish in Slime and bloodthirsty moths in Squelch, and he would revisit worms in 1987 with Bloodworm. Based on the title and the cover art, my expectations for this read were for a cheesy, fun, bloody book with hundreds of thousands of worms sucking the faces off of hapless victims. A book for readers who found James Herbert's The Rats a bit too highbrow, if you will. Based on those low expectations, I have to admit that I was a bit underwhelmed, disappointed even. Slither has more in common with Jaws than it does with The Rats. I say this because in the middle section of the book, the characters ignore the beasts they are supposed to be trying to kill, and instead they focus on an extramarital affair, which I could have done without. Spare me the sucking face and give me more sucking off the face. Right? The protagonist is a television cameraman shooting a report on sewers in London when he is attacked by worms. He then tries to convince the network to do an expose on this threat, but the network is not interested until it's too late. The creatures in this book are called worms, but they behave more like snakes, complete with fangs and hissing and coiling and rearing back the head before lunging in for the strike. I wanted worms. I was promised worms. I don't feel like I got worms. I didn't expect great writing. But it wasn't bad. A few months prior to this, I had to DNF Sean Hutson's Slugs because the writing was too weak to hold my interest. But I didn't have that problem with Slither. With one puzzling exception. Several times in the book, a character is stomping on a worm and crushing it under his or her heel. And the narrator will say something like, grinding it until he heard its vertebrae snap, or crushing it under the heel of its boot and feeling the crack of its vertebrae, something like that, several times. Now, I know next to nothing about worms, except I do know that they are invertebrates. In fact, that is about all I know about worms, and I figured everyone knows that. So why is the author or the editor, if there was one, why are they continually telling me about how the worms are having their vertebrae smashed? It was puzzling and kind of annoying, but not that big of a deal. Also, the timeline is a bit strange because there are things that should take several weeks or even months and they only take a few days. And also there are things that should take a day or two and they take several weeks. It's that attention or lack of attention to detail that was a bit annoying. But overall, the writing wasn't as bad as I would expect from a book called Slither. It's hard not to compare it to The Rats, but unlike The Rats, which manages to create some rather elaborate and intricate set pieces for its creature attacks, in Slither, the worm attacks happen in rather ordinary and mundane settings. There isn't much inventiveness or even silliness in that regard, which was disappointing. And considering the cover art and considering the fact that it was published in 1980, Slither is rather tame in terms of gore. If you're looking for a book with thousands of tiny bloodthirsty creatures, I think The Rats is much better. Slither isn't bad. It just doesn't do anything particularly well. And while it knows what it is, it doesn't take its subject too seriously. It doesn't really have fun with it either, which was disappointing. Slither is a weak Jaws ripoff that tries to pass off snakes as worms and that keeps forgetting that worms do not have vertebrae. My early impressions of horror from the early 1980s. It's like a kid who's in a candy store for the first time and all the adults around him are like, yeah, go ahead, have whatever you want, right? So the kid, he grabs a handful of candies and stuffs them in his mouth, right? And before he's even finished swallowing, he's stuffing more candies in his mouth. And no one's stopping him because, wow, that's crazy. Let's see what happens, right? And the kid, he's enjoying the sugar rush, obviously. But you know that pretty soon he's going to get sick. And he'll probably look back on this event with regret, embarrassment, maybe even shame. He'll probably say to himself, next time I'm in a candy store, I'm going to be more selective and pace myself. Candy should taste good. It shouldn't make me sick. And it doesn't have to. Not exactly a stellar kickoff to this 1980s retrospective, but I can tell you that I have already read for 1981 and I have started to read for 1982, and I can tell you that things do get significantly better. I've already found a few gems that I'm excited to tell you about. I did a much better job picking books for those years than I did for this year. But I do need your help. If you have a horror book that you love, that you can recommend for me, or that you would like me to talk about, a horror book that came out between 1983 and 1989, please tell me about it. I would be very grateful to hear about it. Do you have any experience with any of the books or authors I talked about in this video? What are your impressions or expectations of horror from the early 80s? I always love hearing from you and reading your comments. Thank you for watching. I'll see you in 1981.
3 weeks ago, Judge Smith retired to her chambers with Exhibit A, Rubik's Cube. She hasn't been seen since. Warning, once you get your hands on Rubik's Cube, you may never be able to put it down. Rubik's Cube, over 3 billion combinations, but just one solution from ideal.